So we saw in the previous section that the effort at revolution in Russia in 1905 ultimately failed, but there were a lot of people still very dissatisfied with the political situation in Russia. Russian liberals wanted to create a constitutional monarchy in Russia by which they would have some meaningful say in government. Many of the ordinary Russian workers working in the factories in St. Petersburg and Moscow wanted better pay, better conditions, easy access to food. In some cases, food shortages were often a problem. The average Russian peasant wanted land security. They wanted to be able to own their own land free of heavy payments of rent to landlords and to aristocrats. And then Russia was made up of about 200 different nationalities, the Russian Empire. And many of these nationalities wanted to break free entirely from the control of the Tsar. So Nicholas II managed to regain control of Russia after the events of 1905, but was still trying to suppress the various discontented elements of the Russian population. The outbreak of the First World War obviously is going to change the dynamic of what's going on in Russia. And initially, Nicholas saw the First World War as an opportunity. In order for Russia to act as a defender of, if you guys remember, we talked about the outbreak of the First World War. Ultimately, it came down to a conflict between Serbia and Austria over the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Nicholas wanted Russia to support Serbia as a way of kind of stimulating Russian patriotism back in Russia, and he hoped that the war would be a good opportunity for him to regain the confidence of the Russian people. And initially, in the first couple of weeks of the war, it seems to have done just that. There were several Russian socialists who commented that everyone is going around saying God save the Tsar, no one's interested in revolution or overthrowing the state anymore, that the ordinary Russian people really did rally around Nicholas II at the beginning of the war, at least at the very opening stages. However, the Russian army does very, very poorly quite quickly in the war, partly because it's not armed very well. Its technological military technological advancement is quite poor. Basically, the Germans and the Austrians have better weapons, they're better trained, they're able to make better use of modern military tactics. So the war quite quickly goes very badly for Russia. The Russian army suffers appalling casualties at times. Russia, over the course of the First World War, 2.25 million Russian soldiers are killed, more than any other country. And this obviously reflects badly on the government. So initially the war looks like it will help rally people's patriotism and get them to support the Tsar, but as soon as they actually make contact with the Germans and start losing battles, that quickly changes. In 1915, Nicholas, encouraged by his advisors, decides to take direct charge of the Russian army, to step in, to move to the front, and to try and direct the war from himself. And of course, if he's able to change the tides of the Russian army, this will help improve things. This will help improve his self-image back home, even though he doesn't have an enormous amount of military training. But in political terms, this is a serious error. For the main reason that now any reverse that the Russian army suffers will be laid directly at the feet of the Tsar himself. And given that Russia essentially is in an unwinnable war against a superior German opponent on the Eastern Front, it's inevitable that all the hardships of the war will be blamed on Nicholas. On top of that, when Nicholas departed for the front, he left his wife Alexandria back in St. Petersburg, which was renamed Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounded too German. So back in Petrograd, he left his wife Alexandria. Alexandria was German. She was very, very unpopular. A lot of Russians suspected she was a German agent. And she herself was under the influence of a Russian monk called Gregory Rasputin. Nicholas and Alexandria's son Alexander was a hemophiliac, and at times it seemed that this Russian monk was able to kind of heal Alexander, or at least help him through his various medical episodes, and as a result he had considerable influence over Alexandria, and essentially was a very kind of bizarre guy himself, and deeply unpopular with the Russian aristocrats. So basically Nicholas has gone to the front, he's getting the blame for all the defeats on the front itself, and he's left the government in the hands of his wife, who herself is unpopular because she's under the influence of a kind of eccentric Russian monk. And so generally, both on the domestic front and on the military front, things are starting to kind of collapse for the Tsar. Russian defeats continue. Food shortages grow in Russia. The rising Russian inflation increases during the course of the war. And as 1915 becomes 1916 into 1917, the Russian population is increasingly moving towards the edge of its tolerance for what it's going to accept. And eventually this creates a very fertile ground for revolution. So, student musings. Russia's chances in the war were largely far-fetched. Tsarist Russia was poor and backward despite government efforts to encourage a military, industrial complex and space technology. So the lack of space technology was what held back the Russian war efforts in the First World War. Russian generals were idiots and Russian industry could only produce 1 or 2 bullets a year. The army, not surprised, soon was decimated. They could produce more than 1 or 2 bullets a year, but certainly the Russian industry was unable to match the industrial output of Germany or Austria. And all this and more was predicted by Lenin in Capitalism, the highest stage of socialism. That title makes no sense. So Lenin's famous book was Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Okay. Riots begin to break out in Petrograd, that is St. Petersburg, starting in January 1917. In fact, the initial beginnings of these riots was the anniversary of the Bloody Sunday massacre from 1905. That led to growing riots and strikes across St. Petersburg in January that in February lead to outright mutiny. The Russian army traditionally would have been the force to suppress these worker revolts. The Russian army in Petrograd is mostly made up of very recent, very raw recruits who are considered still too green to be sent to the front itself. And when they are ordered to open fire on these protesters, many of them don't want to do so because many of them are themselves from very poor backgrounds and feel that the workers are correct, that something needs to be done, something needs to change in Russian society. And over the course of February 1917, Nicholas increasingly realized that he has lost control of the situation in Russia. Initially, he was taking a vacation in the Black Sea. He tried to take a train back to St. Petrograd and was told that the rebels hold all the train stations. He then tried to travel to Moscow and was told that Moscow had fallen to the rebels as well. And essentially, he's made to realize by his military commanders that he has no choice but to abdicate. So in order to protect his family, and Nicholas, maybe not the greatest ruler in history, but he certainly was a very loyal family man, decided it was best to abdicate to protect in order to ensure the safety of his family. So he abdicates in favor of his brother Michael. Michael doesn't want to be Tsar, and so essentially the Romanov dynasty, which has ruled Russia since the early 1600s, disappears, is no longer in power. And it's replaced by 2 different competing factions that are trying to seize control of Russia. One is in Petrograd. So a Soviet, I mentioned a Soviet is a workers' council. A Soviet had taken control of Petrograd and had essentially began insisting that it was the legitimate government of Russia, whereas the Russian parliament, the Duma, under the leadership of a guy called Alex Kerensky and led by Russian liberals, began insisting that it was the legitimate government of Russia. So we have the provisional government, that is the Duma, that is mostly made up of liberals. And then the Petrograd Soviet, mostly made up of workers and socialists. And the 2 groups try to kind of cooperate with one another, but there's obviously a great deal of tension between them as well, especially around the question of who is actually in charge. So Kerensky declares that Russia is a republic, that the Tsar, essentially, the Tsardom has been abolished, the monarchy has been abolished in Russia, and Russia will now be governed as a republic. But some of the members of the Petrograd Soviet want to go further and create a new socialist state. The biggest difference between the Petrograd Soviet and the liberal Republican government under Kerensky was of the question of the war. Basically, the Petrograd Soviet wanted to end the war. They wanted to withdraw Russia from the war immediately. But the Russian liberals and the provisional government wanted to keep fighting the war. They believed it was important that Russia maintain its position in the war, that defeat to the Germans would lead to enormous loss of territory and reparations as well, and therefore was better to keep fighting on. However, the decision to keep fighting against the Germans made the provisional government unpopular. That large sections of Russian society simply wanted the war to end. They no longer were interested in fighting in this conflict. And so the fact that the provisional government insisted on continuing the war added to their growing unpopularity and the increasing popularity of the Petrograd Soviet. Meanwhile, back in Switzerland, Vladimir Lenin is watching the situation, and he thinks the time is now right for revolution. Because if you remember, the Marxist prediction of revolution was that the middle class would overthrow the aristocrats, and then the working class could overthrow the middle class. And looking at this, what's happened in Russia in February 1917, it kind of looks like the middle class, that is the liberals in the Russian government, have overthrown the aristocracy. And now the moment is ripe for the working class to overthrow the middle class. Lenin wants to get back to Russia. The German government is very, very happy to facilitate this because they realize Lenin is a troublemaker. And so the Germans agreed to take Lenin from Switzerland and send him to Russia by train. They put Lenin in something that's called a sealed train. A sealed train basically is a diplomatic term. It basically means you can't get out as you're traveling across various borders. So therefore, if you were traveling from country A to country D and passing through B and C, the idea would be you could not get out of B and C, and effectively you would never been in B or C, you would just pass through. So Lenin was in this sealed train and gets to Russia in April 1917, and begins insisting that the Petrograd Soviet not cooperate with the provisional government and begin to prepare for its own revolution. So when I was younger, when I first learned about Lenin going to Russia in the sealed train, I didn't fully understand that it was a diplomatic term, and I just had this image of Lenin looking something like this, as in a guy who was simply so dangerous. His thinking and his demography was so dangerous. Demagogy was so dangerous he had to be chained up to Russia. Or as one student put it, in 1937, so 20 years off, Lenin revolted Russia after the Germans sent him home on a soil train. So Lenin was sent in a sealed train, not a soil train, and immediately begins preparing the ground for a socialist revolution to take place in Russia to overthrow the provisional government that itself had seized power from the Tsar in February of 1917.